At the end of the day, it is entrenched power in the form of fossil fuel companies, big industrial agricultural corporations, individuals with a high carbon intensive lifestyle, right? That consciously or unconsciously kind of protect the status quo. So it is a power struggle, and we have to build counterpower, a society-wide mobilization. The most inclusive social movement, the biggest social movement in history, right? Because if there's no struggle, there is no progress, right? The 8-hour workday, the weekend, civil rights, women's rights, the bike infrastructure here in the Netherlands, outcomes of social struggle.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Fabian Dablander. Fabian is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Dynamics at the University of Amsterdam. He investigates issues surrounding the energy transition and the climate and ecological crises from a theoretical and practical perspective. Fabian is also heavily involved in Scientist Rebellion, the offshoot of Extinction Rebellion that has sprung up, encouraging academics around the world to get involved in nonviolent civil disobedience. Scientist Rebellion is the basis upon which Fabian and I got in touch to have this conversation, and it is a really fascinating one. We have a long back and forth around action, nonviolence versus sabotage, hope versus denial, tipping points of social changes, and power. Where does power lie? How much is power willing to give up? And should we recognize that power is not willing to come to the table to negotiate? I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Fabian, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Richie.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis and what can we do about it?
Well, there are two huge questions, and I think there are many layers to them. So maybe let's start with unpicking this notion of crisis. And one thing I like is this planetary boundaries framework that Earth system scientists have proposed. And planetary boundaries are kind of quantifying global thresholds of key Earth system processes that, when we transgress them, we put ourselves out of the safe operating space for humanity. And, that has been proposed in 2019. There was an update in 2015, and there was a recent update in 2023. And so currently we're breaking 6 out of those planetary boundaries. This is climate change, of course. This is biodiversity loss. In terms of the extinction rates, we're actually at the 6th mass extinction, human caused.
Oh, we're in it?
Yeah, in terms of levels, right? We haven't reached it because past mass extinctions were at least like 75% of all species being dead. But in terms of the rates of extinction, we're in the 6th mass extinction.
Okay.
There's chemical pollution. You have, Japanese researchers finding microplastics in clouds. You have PFAS, right? These forever chemicals that are in the water and the soil. Actually, here in Amsterdam, when I drink water, I'm ingesting too much PFAS, right? I'm being poisoned. You probably as well in the UK. There's, land system change, deforestation. There's overshooting of these nitrogen and phosphorus cycles of the earth because of industrial agriculture, fertilizers. There's freshwater change. So it's really a full-scale assault on the natural world, right? It's not only climate breakdown or ecological breakdown. It's really earth system breakdown. And, why do we face Earth system breakdown, right? And again, there can be many answers given, but I think 2 elements are key. One is really the economic system built around capital accumulation, right? And perpetual growth rather than servicing human needs. So, for example, what is good for human needs, but not profitable, doesn't get done, right? You have drug development in Africa, neglected tropical diseases. There's no market for them, so they don't get developed. At the same time, you have what is profitable yet harmful just being continued, right? You saw that destroying the earth is incredibly profitable, right? We had the energy crisis 2022, all the oil majors making tens of billions of profits, right? And then downscaling the renewable investments. Shell spent 7.5 times more for share buybacks, right, for their shareholders than on renewable investments. And the CEO said, and I'm quoting, he said in February something like, we want to go for lower and lower carbon, but it has to be profitable. Yeah. And there's this fundamental contradiction in the economic system. And these companies, of course, have become incredibly powerful, and they have unduly influenced the decision-making process and the political process, right? I mean, Shell, Total, Exxon have known, at least since the 70s, that their product is causing climate change. Exxon made very precise predictions, quantitative predictions, and yet they have poisoned the public debate, right? They have funded disinformation, denial. And I think, when all is being said and done, the people who are running these corporations probably have committed the greatest crime in human history. And, this system also creates, needs and material wants that are also unsustainable, right? We want bigger houses, we want bigger cars. There's all these advertisements. The IEA a couple of years ago put out a report saying that SUVs were the second biggest cause in the rise of emissions. Yeah? Why do you need an SUV, right? And these industries that are destroying the earth are heavily subsidized. Right? Fossil fuels, the IMF said, get around 1.3 trillion in explicit subsidies. About 90% of the 550 billion or so we give to farmers is harmful. It's for industrial beef, for milk and dairy. And aviation is scandalously cheap compared to taking the train, right? And, we think about the state and the public sector as usually being opposite of the private sector and corporations. But when we look at historic development, and Fabian Scheidler has written this wonderful book that I highly recommend. It's called The End of the Mega Machine. And he kind of shows that, the modern state and institutions of capital accumulation, banks and corporations, really co-evolved over the last 500 years. The state started out with this heavy military apparatus. Most of the expenses were for the military. And they didn't have money to pay for all that. So they went to the banks and the merchants to get these loans, and then funded, colonialism, exploitation. And then with the fruits of those exploitations, paid back with interest to those capital institutions. And you have, Amitav Ghosh talks about this nicely in The Nutmeg's Curse, right? You have the Banda Islands, you have the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch state going in there, slaughtering them to get a monopoly on the nutmeg for the spice trade, earning a lot of wealth. And this kind of violence is only, you can only justify this with some kind of ideology, some kind of mythology, of superiority, of the Western religions, the Western values being kind of better than what these barbaric outsiders have, right? These indigenous peoples, right? And that kind of, I think, is the second element to why we're in this crisis, is a view that, cheapens nature, treats nature as something that is inert, as a resource that we can just deplete, as something to dominate, right? As an externality that is not priced in, right? I mean, if we would give, if we had this connection, I think, as indigenous peoples have with the land and nature, you wouldn't be able to just cut down trees on the scale that we're doing, or destroy these ecosystems at the rate we're doing. So I think these are kind of two elements to the answer of why we're in this crisis. And then the question is, well, what can we do about it? And I think this system, right, what Fabian Scheidler calls the mega machine, will end. I mean, the internal contradictions are just too severe to persist further. But the question is, well, how will it end? Right? Will it end violently with extreme climate change, with rising inequality, with fascism, right, with wars over resources, with mass migration, with eventual collapse, right? Or will we be able to end it before it ends us? And if we look at these planetary boundaries, we see that some issues are arguably more urgent than others. And so I've been focusing more on climate change. And if you just look at say the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, 50% chance to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. It's about 230 gigatons of CO2. Yeah. And that would exhaust at current emissions levels in 6 years, right? So there's really, because we have left it so late, there's really a clock associated with the struggle that past struggles didn't have. And so we really need to shift into emergency mode to end fossil fuels, to end industrial agriculture. At the same time, doing so in a manner that is transformative, right? That doesn't reproduce structures of oppression and domination that we had in the past, right? The renewable energy be decentralized, democratized, moving it out of the profit motive. Have the citizens' assemblies, right, to put forward a more deliberative version of democracy rather than a representative view. And, these are big picture things, right? But as individuals, there's a nice way, I think, to view this. Christian Nielsen, who was a collaborator of mine, and he wrote this paper in Nature Energy 2021, viewed, we have kind of different roles we play, right? We have consumers, we can act as consumers, we can act as investors or people who donate to organizations, as role models in our communities and organizations, right? It's okay, it's good if you don't, eat meat, but if you can shift your organization to a vegetarian cafeteria, it's much more important. And I think what's most critical is to engage in collective action, right? Because we have to realize that and there was this nice paper also by Kevin Anderson and Ian Stoddard and others on 3 decades of climate mitigation, why we failed to bend the emissions curve. And they basically looked at this with an interdisciplinary team of researchers through various lenses, and they said, look, at the end of the day, it is entrenched power in the form of fossil fuel companies, big industrial agricultural corporations, individuals with a high carbon intense lifestyle, right, that consciously or unconsciously kind of protect the status quo. So it is a power struggle, and we have to build counterpower, a society-wide mobilization, the most inclusive social movement, the biggest social movement in history, right? Because if there's no struggle, there is no progress, right? The 8-hour workday, the weekend, civil rights, women's rights, the bike infrastructure here in the Netherlands, outcomes of social struggle. And one tool there is, I think, civil disobedience, right? To put your body on the line, to disrupt business as usual, to create dilemmas for those in power. You have to be annoying to save the world, and to compel the people in power to act, and to shift into emergency mode, to reorient these priorities. And part of the work I'm doing is with Scientist Rebellion, right, as one pillar of support of society, the academic community, and getting them more engaged and mobilized in acts of civil disobedience or other types of climate action, right? I mean, if you can't do civil disobedience, that's perfectly fine. I mean, there's so many roles in the struggle, in the climate movement, that could benefit from whatever skills and expertise people have. Doesn't necessarily need to be to go onto the street, right? So I think this was a long answer, but this was a big question as well. So I leave it at that.
No, that was a really, really great answer. So to summarize, are the same ideologies which enabled the creation of such an exploitative and extractive economic system have then driven that extraction and exploitation to the point where we are pushing our planet over breaking 6 of its boundaries into very, very dangerous sort of tipping zones that could cause cascading impacts, which are sort of irreversible. That's sort of what these tipping points are, right? We could change the planet's climate and thus its ecosystems forever. And for the rate of extinction, we are in now this 6th mass extinction event. I didn't know that. And this has all also been sort of facilitated by relationships between fossil fuel companies, between industrial agriculture, essentially between corporations and governments. And, those, how did you put it? Certain individuals, powerful individuals who may or may not know what they're doing. Sure, also, let's say by like a ruling class who have been in the driver's seat whilst we are heading towards the cliff. There's one thing that, and also then obviously, what can we do? Civil disobedience. There's this thing you said at the end, about compelling power to act. At what point do we say that power cannot be compelled to act effectively. I think this is now the question that we're all facing, right? It's been the hottest July. July was the hottest month on record. It was the hottest August ever, hottest September ever. We're at 1.8 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures because of El Nino as well. At what point do we agree? Oh, and global fossil fuel consumption is at an all-time high. At what point do we understand or do we agree that power cannot be compelled to act? Because actually, the biggest state companies in the world are state-owned. The biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, are state-owned. Governments are the biggest producers and consumers of fossil fuels. That's why they cannot bring this problem under control. They are driving the problem. To compel power to act would be to compel power to understand that its hegemony, that its dominance is over, that it's time for a new world order, that, it's going to be China, because my God, if there's one country that's sort of seen this problem coming a mile off and done something about it, it's been China. I mean, and let's get into all of the nitty gritties of the different forms of civil disobedience and all the different movements that we have seen throughout human history. But can you speak to that? At what point do we agree that power cannot be compelled to act?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe two things. I mean, first, and this was one of Gandhi's insight, right? That oppression always, on some level, requires the consent of the oppressed. And he combined his notion of passive resistance with to form like civil resistance, right? You passively obey laws, you boycott them, because when you become ungovernable at scale, then those who govern need to give in, right? I mean, just imagine, here we have these protests on the A12 in The Hague, in the Netherlands. I think one of the most interesting campaigns in Europe right now, where I think at a high time we're like at least 20,000, 25,000 on the street, right, on a Saturday. Now, suppose that this would be 2 million, right? And they wouldn't leave, right? I mean, there is at least in a democracy, however broken it is in our Western world, I think if you become ungovernable at scale, there's nothing that those in power can do here, right? But then the question is that pathway available to us, right? Can we mobilize enough people to engage in collective action, to engage in civil resistance, to become ungovernable at scale, right? And I think that's an open question. But that's at least from the movement that I've kind of looked at, it's part of the theory of change, right? You mobilize enough people, engage in mass civil disobedience, you put so much pressure on the system that they have to give in. Now, and ideally, you put transformative solutions forward, like citizens' assemblies, right? I mean, I think it's an ingenious move from Extinction Rebellion to say, we don't have the policy solutions. We let a representative group of people decide, right? And you have had that in the UK, right? As you know, in France, in Ireland, in Austria. And these citizens' assemblies come up with much more progressive policy proposals than the governing parties, right? Then the question is, well, can those be put into law, right? And that hasn't happened so far. But I think if you become really enormous at scale with various pillars of support, right? With lawyers, with the churches, with the academics, I think it's possible. I don't think we haven't tried hard enough to get there. Because maybe you respond to that, because I also have another thought. But yeah.
I mean, let me just push back on it, because the climate campaign, Extinction Rebellion, was the fastest growing civil rights movement essentially in the history of mankind. From one year to the next, it was present in it had local chapters in about 50 different countries. I think that's up to 100 and something around the world. There has never been anything like it. Never in the history of social progress has there been anything like it. It's a phenomenal movement, and the people behind it deserve a huge amount of credit. But I think it just goes to show that this is sort of the first social crises that we are facing that is so interlinked with the very fabric of what makes this mega machine run, that actually, like, all of the fights that have been won along the way were very particularly contextualized as well, right? Like, people really like to reference Gandhi in the non-violent thing. Well, he was also up against the British Empire that was a bit tired and was well aware and they needed to start using soft power instead of hard power. And I'd figure out that probably, you could colonize economically just as well as you could with a military. They had another plan ready to slip into place. It wasn't like they just went, oh gosh, yeah, no, that's oh God, exploiting people, racism, terrible, how awful of us. Of course we'll retreat. No, they had something else ready to go and ready to be deployed. The thing with what Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and what all of these groups are now demanding that makes it much more difficult to give in to the demands, that as opposed to sort of a niche, let's say, of like leftist politics, it's demanding, the deconstruction of the entire system. It's demanding we find a different fuel. And because fossil fuels are so energy dense and so cheap to sort of get your hands on, there will never be another fuel like it. The system cannot run on anything else. Can't run on renewables in the same way. And so that's why power is so incapable of facing up to these, not just sort of social demands, but like scientific truths as well. I mean, it would demand the whole thing kind of crumbling.
So the question is, I think fundamentally, right, we have to end the mega machine, right? We have to create a system that is not built on profit, on exploitation, and so on. But that is a struggle that is not one of 2 decades or 3 decades or 4 decades, right? That's really, just looking at how the system developed, it also took centuries, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is really a transformation that, we won't see in my lifetime, right? I'm actually pretty confident about this. Yeah, I think we can have, hints of it, right? And certain elements to it. But I think there's just a lot to do there, right? But on a shorter time scale, right? When we talk about climate breakdown, right? There we could see in my lifetime the collapse of civilization because of it, right?
Mm.
Now, it is possible to transition to 100% renewable energy system, right? It's just possible, right? So there are solutions out there that we can advocate and push for, that that might not usher in this utopia, right? But certainly an improvement of the current state. So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I'm a bit, I see, where we are, and ideally where we need to be. Right? There's this enormous gap, and it's too much even to just have in mind, right? Because it just paralyzes you. If you really think about it, you're like, okay, the mega machine is just going to end us, right?
Yeah.
But we can have local struggles and winning certain elements that can then kind of inspire tipping processes, social tipping processes, change processes that then trickle outwards, right?
Mm.
So, we probably see 2 degrees of heating, right? But 2 degrees of heating can, we can build a society, we can build communities, we can prepare for that in a way that it would still not be a terrible life, right? So I guess, yeah, there's a level of realism or pragmatism in terms of what we can do, what we can't do, while still having the goal in mind, right? So I'm not sure we should throw our arms up in the air and say this is too big of a problem, right?
Oh,
But
God,
to really, to kind of start locally and see what we can do. But maybe I'm misunderstanding your point also.
Oh, yeah, my point is definitely not to throw our hands up in the air and do nothing. I suppose my point is about changing tactics.
So,
Yeah.
what would you suggest?
I'm a big fan of Sabotage Against Property.
Right.
You know what book I've read. All the listeners know which book I've read.
Everybody has read that book.
Yeah,
I even watched the movie. It's a good movie.
Did you? I haven't seen it yet.
I can recommend it.
Would you recommend it for the very clear instructions that are laid out in the movie, or for the story?
There are no clear instructions. But Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it is indeed a different tactic, right? You and it reminds me of this other book which I can recommend called The Levers of Power by I think Kevin Schwartz and a bunch of others, and they basically say, well, quoting John Dewey, politics is just a shadow big business casts on society. At the end of the day, it's big corporations that are running the show, and they are scholars. They're really social scientists, and they analyze the Obama era, I think, on healthcare and climate and one other topic, and they just show how big corporations are influencing the decision-making process, not only through lobbying, but also through capital strikes. They're kind of saying, hey, I'm not going to invest there unless you give me these kind of things, right? And you see it with companies in the US having cities, kind of fight for their headquarters being situated there, right?
Yeah.
So this is the kind of dynamics. But from that point of view, you would actually say, hey, it's completely infeasible to make demands to the government, right? Because they are just a shadow of big business, right? And what you should actually do is compel big business to shift gears, which could then influence the policymaking process. So they give this example. I think there was a campaign, I forget exactly which one, but maybe Birmingham and the civil rights, where actually they put a lot of pressure on businesses because the business would lose money by them protesting there, and then the businesses talked to the politics and said, hey, you need to advance civil rights because we are losing all these customers, right? Now, the problem here, I think, with this analysis is that the fossil fuel industry has to die, and that's quite a different situation, right? Because you won't shift their priorities to say to the government, okay, let's abandon fossil subsidies, let's not explore oil and gas, because fundamentally that is their proposition, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of I think that's different to past cases. And then you could say, well, maybe that doesn't work, but maybe just sabotaging, all this LNG infrastructure and oil infrastructure could, I don't know, create enough damage that the oil industry stops expanding, right? But I think that's also not a feasible theory of change, because it has, at the end of the day, I think it has to be some form of state power, that says, okay, we're shifting to emergency and we're doing this and this and that.
I just don't know what it would take. There were sort of anecdotes, that's the wrong word, but the tale that we told ourselves last summer in Europe was like, okay, 33 million people displaced in Pakistan, and that's terrible. So for the people who get it, for the people who are on site, that's terrible. Okay, governments aren't doing anything. When it hits Europe, when it reaches our shores, that'll be the moment that'll kick them into action.
Yeah.
We saw giant hailstorms in Italy in July. Greece, huge parts of Greece flooded and on fire at the same time. Entire islands evacuated, entire land lost, villages gone, 10,000 carcasses of rotting livestock in one valley. I mean, it's not, nothing's happening. Just before we hit record, we were talking about the fact that Sunak is expanding, he's going ahead with Rosebank. The United States is going ahead. They're building like 20 new LNG terminals around their coastlines, all of which are going to be have more emissions than Willow, the big oil field that took a lot of attention. It's oil, this whole thing about peak oil 2008, we're probably running out of oil in some way. At least the EROI, energy return on investment, is going to be too high because drilling down to get the shale stuff, which is just lower quality, it's not going to make more sense. But if you speak to people in the fossil fuel industry, they're like, yeah, oil's kind of, that's probably going to sort itself out as a problem. But we have enough coal for 300 years. We've got enough gas for 250 years. Like we're not going to stop using the stuff when it's there. And because 90% of fossil fuel production is done in the name of states, state-owned companies, not the oil majors, this lifeblood that courses through the veins of the mega machine is being pumped by states. And so this idea that maybe a state power will come around and do something, I just don't think that that's a sort of feasible option anymore. Because you know what? There are great ideas. There's great ideas in Latin America. There's great ideas in the Pacific. There are nation states that are feeling the impact of climate change first and would like this to stop. And because also they understand that stopping fossil fuels essentially puts a wrench in colonialism and extraction and all of these things as well, and global capitalism. But they're not listened to. They're not helped. They're not given a voice. They're barely given a vote. I just fear that after sort of like, how do I put this? After the peace years post World War II, in which sort of, the boomers, the people in charge, and us, their offspring, in this part of the world, have never known such peace. It's been a peaceful time, even though it's been still difficult, and even though it's certainly not been peaceful for very many minorities. But on the whole, the struggle has progressed pretty civilly, and it's like we're kind of we don't have the teeth in the claws for this next bit.
Yeah. I mean, look, we have continuous debates about sabotage, right? And I think, there was an Ende action last month or so at Rügen, right? They're building this LNG terminal. And in the action consensus, they also said, look, if some people just want to sabotage, that's totally fine, right? In the end, I believe it didn't happen. But you could certainly make a case. I mean, Mal makes quite a convincing case, right?
Yeah.
That certainly, if you talk about being the investment risk, like in the Gelände, disrupting these things, if you're there for a day, I mean, you're not doing much, right? But if you just destroy the machine, right, and sabotage it in a way that it takes more time to build out, then you're certainly a bigger disruption, right? But I don't think we should. Well, not fool ourselves, but I think that, I mean, would that be sufficient? Why would that be sufficient? Like, would that? I mean, certainly the on one level, there's a great podcast I can highly recommend it, of somebody who's done a lot of sabotage. He's really looked into it. And he reviewed Marl's book, and he also was like a little bit, on some level, if you sabotage, then you've less supply. I mean, probably you don't make much of a dent, but you've less supply, the price goes up, right? The dynamics is such that actually they make more profit. So I wouldn't say, we've tried everything now with pushing state actors, and now we should do sabotage, and then it's going to be fine, right? But I certainly, I don't want to incriminate myself, but I can understand why some people would feel the need to engage in sabotage, right? And it is interesting because we are not, as a climate movement, certainly in Europe, there's a lack of skill also to do these things, right? I mean, you have Greenpeace to do these crazy actions on oil rigs and so on, right? But if you look at the average Scientist Rebellion person, I mean, it's an academic, right? Or Extinction Rebellion, students, young people, they're not. I guess there's also just a lack of skill to do this at scale.
Yeah.
So on some level, I think there's actually a need to, again, I don't want to incriminate myself, but train these things, and also think about how do we fight in a world on fire, because we know it's getting worse. But even if we do everything, we're going to reach 1.5 in the every 20 degrees, right? So there's going to be more impacts, probably war, more migration, right? And how do we act as a climate movement in that ever worsening atmosphere? I don't think this is being really strategized at the level that would be necessary.
Yeah. I agree. I wonder how much of it is a kind of a disbelief as well in the face of it all. Like, I've been doing this work for many years, and myself personally, it wasn't until I came back from a conference recently and, got the train all the bloody way there, because that's what you do. And so it was a long journey back. and I was exhausted and I'd spent the weekend with capitalists and venture capitalists and them all sort of talking about how green tech is going to save us. And I spent a lot of my weekend yelling at them, and I burst into tears when I walked through my front door and just really felt the grief of it for the first time. And I think I'd been sort of in a suspended state of disbelief up until that moment. Like, surely not. Surely something will come along. Someone will come along.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. There will be a social tipping point, yada, yada, yada. And like, I think finally getting a glimpse at, because like as you say, this big picture is really complex, but getting enough glimpses really at like the valves of the mechanical heart of this thing, the fact that fossil fuels are its lifeblood, the way that that is connected to government power and Western hegemony, and the way that's connected to the financial system and corporations, and like it's not something that can just be substituted for renewables, for example, because I mean, you do that and you essentially guarantee China coming out as the world's top power,
Well,
which
that's
obviously
because
Western
we
companies don't want to do.
yeah.
Western countries. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly lost a lot, right? I mean, Germany kicked off kind of the renewable energy revolution with these feed-in tariffs, and then at some point just decided to discontinue them, handing it over to China, right?
Yeah.
But you have things like the Inflation Reduction Act that are trying to stimulate, right,
Yeah.
green industries again, right? And that's an interesting dynamic because then, of course, these green technology companies are in cahoots. They are in fighting with the fossil fuel industry, right? So one theory of change could be, well, let capital eat another part of capital.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I agree with you that I think we're all in denial on some level, right? Because this is just too. I mean, if you really sit down and just let it in, I don't think you would be capable of getting anything done anymore. And what crystallized it for me again was in June. I actually had a heat exhaustion. I was moving house, and it was like, I don't know, 33 degrees or so, and I skipped lunch, and then I was just feeling terribly. I had to vomit, and for 4 days I just was lying in bed.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and I was like, wow, this is. I mean, of course, that was just part of it was the stupidity. I should have eaten, I should have drank more, right? But this wasn't on my bingo card, right? And then I learned about this PFAS business, which wasn't on my agenda so much. I'm not sure it is on yours, but the dynamics that were similar, right? DuPont invented these forever chemicals, Teflon, right? And this non-sticking material in the 40s. And then throughout the 60s and 70s realized, actually, this is cancer causing. Our employees are dying, and they were hiding this fact. And only later, here the 2000s or so, it kind of came out, right? And they've lied to the public about it, and now they're everywhere. There was a press release from the RIVM, which is our public health institute, saying, "Hey, Dutch people ingest too much PFAS through food and drink. You should diversify your diet to decrease the risk of ingesting too much." And it's like, I just realized again, okay, it is really full-on Earth system breakdown. It's not only fossil fuels, but it's always where there's this profit motive and this lying to the public. It's just bad things happen. And indeed, I mean, it's this mega machine that is almost impossible to attack, right? But what else is there, right? I mean, we have to do, everything we can as strategically as we can, right?
Absolutely. But by its nature, it should be in one way. And let me run with this thought to see where we end up. But it should be easy to attack in some ways, because we know that it's not resilient. We know that like the globalization agenda is part of the reason that everything is breaking down, because resilient complex systems are diverse, and this global system that we have is not diverse whatsoever. And that's one of the reasons that our supply chains are so fragile. It's one of the reasons that our food systems are so vulnerable to shock, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an incredibly complex system that is very, very difficult to understand. But the nature of its complexity, i.e. its lack of diversity, should make it that it is actually, there must be some levers that can be pulled by the general public to trigger a sequence of events, because they didn't build it for resilience. It wasn't this system. I mean, nobody built this system, this system kind of built itself, but it's not been built for diversity. It's not been built for resilience. It's not been built to last. It's not been built to serve people. It's been built for efficiency. It's been built for maximization of profit. And it's been built to cut corners and cut costs. Like it's fundamentally fragile in its nature. There must be. I've got a friend who talks about the port on the Death Star. She's like, well, just there'll be a thing. There will be a thing that, or maybe a couple of things, maybe a couple of ports on the Death Star. By its nature, it's fragile. It must be able to be stopped.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, one thing, here in the Netherlands, right, we have this strong campaign against fossil subsidies, right? I mean, this is one of the first thing you should do is just stop with the things that are destroying the earth, right? You don't want to finance them. And I think that's winnable here. That's really winnable. I mean, now we spend around 40 billion on fossil fuel subsidies in the Netherlands. And the plan is to spend on climate 30 billion until 2030. Right?
Madness.
Yeah, it's insane. And it's companies like Tata Steel, steel industry, Shell, who paying 100 times less in taxes, like they use 40% of the electricity, but only pay 1% of the taxes. So, if we win that, right, that will already be progress, right? And that will potentially have effect on, okay, now suddenly some part of the renewable sector can compete better with fossil fuels and so on and so forth, right? And then you can have certain dynamics that will help further, right? Or you just really push for citizens' assembly, right? That's, I think, a transformative policy, right? I mean, I think there are levers to play with and to push for, but it's just that that the push needs to be harder. I mean, I do believe we can end fossil fuel subsidies. If there are a million people on the street, I mean, what are you going to do? Like you don't have a democratic mandate to, I mean, in the UK, it's different because that's basically, I mean, that's really, Sunak wasn't elected, right? I mean, so there's troubles there, and then maybe you need to adopt a strategy, right? But here in the Netherlands, I think this is winnable. I think it's really a problem of scale, and this is what is actually mind-boggling. It's actually mind-boggling because I spent the pandemic. Luckily, I was on an island. I had an Italian girlfriend, and we spent it there. And I dug into the climate science, and really became like, over months, I realized, okay, it's orders of magnitude worse than I thought. And then I had this kind of insight, this transformation, and then I went back to Amsterdam, to civilization. And I talked to people, to my academics, and said, like, okay, guys, this is the greatest emergency we have ever faced. And then you see professors and other people saying, like, yeah, but it's too big. You can't really do anything about it, and it's like, it's so complicated, And you realize, and you like, I mean, this was really like, I was like, and I think if we get more people mobilized, then things can start happening. And we're not mobilized. I mean, I give these direct action trainings, right? I talk for half an hour about the climate and the scale of the emergency and so on. And people come here, and they say, I haven't quite understood, the urgency and the scale of the problem, right? And these are people who are interested. And if you just talk the average person on the street, I don't think getting it to the degree that it is necessary. So there is some kind of information problem still, right? I mean, you have these Eurobarometer survey results, and people say, "Oh, climate is one of the biggest issues," and so on and so forth. But they're not on the street, right? So there's a mismatch here. They need to be on the street. They need to realize that nobody is coming to save us. Nobody is coming to save us, and we have to get active. And that is something that we haven't learned. I never had to struggle for anything. I mean, I'm a deeply privileged person from the global north. I never had to struggle for anything, right? So we haven't learned how to engage in collective action, right? So there's a learning process that we have to go through. But but I think if we manage that, we can really, really change the course. This is a fundamental belief I have. Maybe it's a little bit of hopium, but I think if we scale this up massively, things can really start shifting.
I agree with you. I do not think that it's locked in and certain. I mean, some things are like 1.5, probably even 2. I think that huge amounts of civil action can change the course of history. I believe that the civil disobedience that we are seeing is fundamentally scalable, especially when it's nonviolent, and especially in nations like Holland, where the police, just sort of have given up and gone home, been like, right, okay, yeah. And it's getting good press coverage. There are certain things, though, that I think we need to be as members of the public that are engaged in this work, that we need to be more honest about, like the fact that the press isn't on our side, because that's another node in sort of how the elite maintain their position. The fact that nobody is coming to save us, so it is very likely that actually 1 million people on the streets, maybe you could then say, oh, you don't have a democratic mandate, but it's not about democracy. Fossil fuels running this system is not about democracy, because it's fundamentally not a democratic system. I think that there are so many illusions that are sort of tacked onto like social life in the global north that mean that we accept certain processes as they are. And I think that's what's really interesting about the climate action that we're seeing around the world. It really is like democracy is coming up against reality. Which is, we don't have a way to not use these fuels if we want to maintain our global position. So we're just going to ignore the biggest global call for change in the history of humankind, So I just think it's also being aware of, like, if we're asking people to join, which we should be, like, first of all, action needs to be diverse, because that's how you make it resilient. It needs to be so many people doing lots and lots and lots of different things. There also needs to be an awareness of, like, okay, like it's like do you know what? It's like being in a bad relationship, all right? Like, you always need to have your boundary of, like, this is what I'm willing. Like, when it reaches this point, this is when I leave. And you make that like as objectively and kind of like early on as possible. Like, this is how much shit I'm willing to take. This is what. But at this point, it's a no from me. And you have to take that before it becomes worse and worse and worse. Otherwise, you're kind of like, your shifting baseline syndrome of normality changes with it as well.
Yeah.
Like, I think as a movement, we need to come together and sort of say, how many no's, how many times do we get ignored? How many COP promises broken? How many conferences wasted? How many new oil and gas licenses granted? At what point do we just say no and say, okay, we're not going to ask you lot for anything anymore because you're incapable, and we're going to start taking matters into our own hands? I don't know what that means. And I don't think that sabotage is the only way. But there needs to be this, like, I think, more pragmatic awareness as well from those of us within the movement that, quite frankly, we've been doing this for 50 years and things are only getting worse. And not because of some kind of like evil plot, but because of system dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with you with that there is some thinking that is required on, okay, what would it mean to not call for the government to do something, but to just take it in our own hands, right? I mean, how would it look like?
Yeah.
And what can be done there, right? I mean, this, I think, will in general be useful also when things become really bad, right? To build these communities that can increase the resilience of a society. Right? I mean, I'm trying to volunteer at a place here that is kind of off grid, has their own solar panels, filters their urine, creates their own fertilizer, that kind of stuff, and there is something to be said to thinking about, okay, what skills are required there, right? And how can we make communities more resilient? But I don't think, certainly not I think in Western democracies, that we could just build up an alternative structure of governing next to, the normal representative democracy, that we should say, okay, we just do this our own way, because there is something that we need to end on that level, right? It needs to be needs to be ended. So I'm not 100% sure how this would look like, but it certainly would require more people regardless, right?
Mhm.
So whatever we are agreeing or disagreeing on, there needs to be a massive scale up in terms of mobilization, right? And the mobilization needs to be diverse, right? It needs to take working people into account, right? Because historically also, just if you look at socialist tradition, they at the point of production, they have a lot of power, right? They just stop working for the production of oil, right? Or these financial businesses. I mean, they can have a lot of impact. You saw this in France, right? And there, the French are fantastic in terms of the protests, right? And garbage piling up in Paris. You had this incredible industrial action, but also there, the progress I think was not sufficient. But I agree with this diversity, and I also agree actually with that the media is not really on our side, and we are doing some research on this. I mean, we've scraped some of the big newspapers in Germany and looked at the reporting on climate action groups, and one thing that stands out is the Bild Zeitung, and which is this tabloid, which has almost as many readers as the New York Times. I mean, it's a massive reach.
Good God.
Yeah, it's and you read the reporting, and it's so painful. It's not. It doesn't mention the climate crisis. It only mentions the disruption. It puts them in a bad light. There's this one activist who looks a bit like Shakira, and then they call her climate Shakira, and just talk about what she's doing and blah, 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 never mentioning the climate crisis, right?
Yeah.
And so they really, if we talk about who the climate movement polarizes, guys, this is mediated by a terrible media ecosystem that is increasing the hatred against these people. So, yeah, I agree on that front. And we have some data to back this up, but I think it's pretty in your face also.
Have you seen that data from I think it's the University of Colorado? They have this lab called MECCO, and every month they do a big update on sort of analyzing Anglophone media from around the world to look at trends. And they did a report 20 years ago on like bias around reporting on the anthropogenic nature of climate change. And then they did an update to it as well a couple of years ago. It's very, very, very good. Very good, their stuff. And they're updating it all the time. And they're very, very nice. I interviewed one of their researchers. They're really on it in terms of the media being part of the problem.
Yeah.
It's grim, isn't it? It's very, very grim, this situation. Yeah.
But I mean, and it is crazy also if you think about it, right? I mean, I'm 30 years now, right? I'm alive in the 2020s, 6 years current emission until 1.5 degrees, right? So there is an insanity of being alive at this moment, and in these trainings, I'm always reminded of a scene in Lord of the Rings when I talk to people, and it's like Frodo who says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And then Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such time."
Yeah.
But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us, right? And it's, it is what it is, and this is our project. This is our generational project. And we have to step up to that and be aware of our responsibility. And in that struggle, actually also find meaning, and happiness, and realizing that there is suffering, and suffering will get worse, but there's still a possibility for community, for making things better. It's never too late to do everything we can, right? As Ketan said once. So, yeah, I think we have to come to terms with this and create hope and meaning and happiness through action, through struggle.
Yeah. Fabian, thank you so much. I think that's the right note to end on for this conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah.
My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Yeah, I think there are many people, but just because this happened this week, I think Gianluca Grimalda would be a great pick. I'm not sure whether you saw his story in The Guardian. I mean, he traveled at the beginning of this year to Papua New Guinea to kind of do research on these communities, how they're being affected by climate change, right? And then, I mean, he traveled by land and sea for 40,000 kilometers. And then his research was delayed because, at some point he was held by ex-combatants from the Civil War and his research items were stolen and so on. And in general, these communities are, of course, very skeptical of a white man. So there were some delays, but his institute, I think, Kiel Institute for the World Economy, said, look, you have to be back by Monday, otherwise you're fired. And he said, look, I can't in good conscience take a plane back and emit, 3 or 4 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions, because I think it's not the right thing to do. We have to break with business as usual. And I've also promised these local communities, to not do it, to not take a flight back. And so I think he would be great to have, because I think it reminds us that really courageous acts of individuals can be deeply inspiring and be part of this change process. Yeah. And he probably also just has great stories to tell, like what was the journey like? What are these communities? How is the impact there? It reminds me a bit about Alexander von Humboldt. There's this nice book, The Invention of Nature. I'm not sure whether you read it. It's fantastic. It's incredible. And I was like, I'd be curious to hear what he has to say for sure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Fabian. This has just been wonderful.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Take care.
You too. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.